There's some people who don't think diet has to do with Alzheimer's. They're crazy. Sugar was incredible at causing cognitive dysfunction. Within 2 weeks, this is the cause of Alzheimer's.
Dr. Richard Johnson is a board-certified physician and medical researcher who specializes in metabolic health.
His groundbreaking research in Alzheimer's disease will revolutionize the way we treat cognitive decline and ultimately prevent it.
People probably would prefer to get cancer to dementia. If you get it, you kind of lose who you are, and the people around you lose you before you die. There's something that's going on. Genetics can't really account for that by itself. It's increasing too rapidly to be explained by a gene. The trick is to try to prevent it. In the early stages, it's likely reversible. Now, I want you to know there is no one that's ever given a possible cause of Alzheimer's that begins from the beginning to the end, and that can explain the epidemic. That's why I think this is so strong. It's unbelievable. Fructose levels are sky high in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, 5 to 6-fold higher in all the regions of the brain associated with Alzheimer's. Be aware that certain foods are not good for the brain. Pancakes, bread, potatoes, rice, cereal. Artificial sugars have their own problem. Anything sweet, spit it out.
So I want to talk about the solution, what people should eat if they want to not have Alzheimer's. Is there a way to do that through dietary means?
Yes, I think there is. So the first thing is,
this episode features Dr. Richard Johnson, and we're talking about the true cause of Alzheimer's disease, and it's something hidden in our foods. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button, because we know that food is medicine, and by the simple act of subscribing, you can help share the message to millions more people that need to hear the truth. And now for the episode with Dr. Richard Johnson. Dr. Johnson, welcome.
thank you. Glad to be here.
When we look around us, we'll know somebody that has Alzheimer's disease or some sort of brain disease. And over 100 years ago, only 3 people had Alzheimer's. And now it's over 50 million people. So obviously there's something in our environment or our food that's causing it. So today, Dr. Johnson is going to share new research conducted with the best brain doctors in the world. We're going to talk about the true cause of Alzheimer's disease and how you can actually reverse it and stop you getting Alzheimer's. So Dr. Johnson, my first question, do you think Alzheimer's disease is preventable?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a metabolic disease and it's preventable. First, we should probably just talk about Alzheimer's disease, if that's okay. So as you mentioned, it was first reported maybe 100 years ago. And there was this thought that it was always present, but underdiagnosed. And a lot of times people would call dementia among the elderly senile dementia, and it was kind of excluded from Alzheimer's. And so for a while, people were thinking that the reason Alzheimer's is increasing is because people are living longer. But that's not true. And just as you say, studies over the last, decade have shown that there's an increasing incidence of dementia, and especially of Alzheimer's, that cannot be accounted for by increasing longevity. And there is some other major driver. And in fact, it's probably increasing dramatically, sort of in line with what you said. So the first step is that there's something that's going on. And genetics can't really account for that by itself, because it's increasing too rapidly to be explained by a gene. And people have looked extensively for genes, and there are genetic predispositions, like if you have certain genetic polymorphisms, they call it, that may increase your risk, but there is no gene that causes Alzheimer's disease. And so, there's been tremendous mystery about it, because it's such a horrible disease, because if you get it, you kind of lose who you are, and the people around you lose you before you die, because you're no longer there in terms of being able to communicate or recognize and talk. And it goes through stages, and some advance slower than others, and others advance really rapidly. So it's a very scary disease, and it's becoming a common cause of death. And no one, I mean, people probably would prefer to get cancer to dementia. Dementia is just a horrible condition. So originally, when Alzheimer described the disease, he showed that the brain was shrunken and atrophied, and this is the classic finding in dementia, is that the brain starts to shrink and the cells that do the thinking, which we call neurons, they basically die, and so you start losing your brain cells and the brain shrinks and atrophies. And once it gets really bad, it's very difficult to reverse it. So the trick is to try to prevent it. And in the early stages, it's likely reversible. So that's my answer to your question. And I base that upon the science that we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. I want to talk about people that have heard of Alzheimer's, but they've also heard of dementia, because I think even some doctors don't even know what's happening in the brain when people have Alzheimer's or even dementia, and they try to use pharmaceutical drugs to slow it down because you can't reverse it. Can we distinguish the difference between, there's not really a difference, but the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia so people can understand?
Yeah, so dementia is basically a general term for when you lose your cognitive function. You're unable to do the things you normally do. It tends to cause a loss of recent memory first, so you can't remember what you had for breakfast or where you are, and you may hear something, and then 2 minutes later you don't remember it, and then it gets worse and worse. So dementia is a general condition. It's really a descriptive condition because you can diagnose dementia just by doing mental testing, and sometimes it's relatively obvious. But there are different types of dementia, and some are completely reversible. There's one caused by a deficiency in a vitamin, thiamine, vitamin B1. And if you're B1 deficient, you can absolutely develop a reversible dementia, because if you go on thiamine, it will come, your cognitive function will largely come back unless you've had it for a long time. And the longer you have it, the less reversible it is. Now, thiamine deficiency and dementia from that is classically associated with alcohol. And alcohol affects thiamine uptake and affects thiamine. And thiamine is a vitamin that really is important for generating energy in the brain. And but some pregnant women with hyperemesis gravidarum, which is this condition where you're vomiting a lot, some of them can get this condition from thiamine. And anyway, there are a variety of causes. And another major causes is what we call vascular dementia. That's typically seen with people with severe high blood pressure, and they get little small, what we call infarcts, which is basically little parts of the brain don't get enough blood, and that part of the brain dies, and you get these little infarcts, and it's associated with severe hypertension, because in hypertension the blood vessels have to constrict, and if they constrict too much, they don't get enough blood through, because they don't want high pressure, so they kind of constrict like on a hose. So the pressure's high before it, and the flow is low, and so that is not good for the brain either. So vascular dementia is pretty common, is a pretty common cause. There are other causes, but Alzheimer's was associated with a specific condition in the shrinking brain, and they call it amyloid plaques and tau protein. Sorry for the complicated words here, but amyloid just means kind of like a protein gel, sort of, that forms in the brain, and it forms between the neurons or brain cells, and you can see it in a microscope. And this is what Alzheimer described. And there are also these things, he called them tangles, neurofibrillary tangles, but these are tangles in the cell themselves that are due to a protein that normally isn't there, and that's called tau protein. So Alzheimer's became known as a dementia associated with a shrinking brain. All dementias, the brain shrinks with dementia. But it's also associated with these two findings: amyloid plaques and tau protein aggregates, or tau protein. And so when people started worrying about what caused it, everyone said, well, it's got to be these amyloid plaques. That's what distinguishes this type of dementia. So the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the whole scientific research field, started focusing on what drives amyloid plaques. What are they? Where do they come from? What causes them? And can we stop them? And there's over 20 drugs, over 20, 25 drugs that actually went for clinical testing to try to figure out what's causing these amyloid plaques and tau protein. People made vaccines. They made things to block the formation of these amyloid plaques. And all these went to clinical testing, and they all failed, except for a couple that kind of have like very borderline benefits. It was really a disaster. And it really raised the question, are we treating the right thing to prevent Alzheimer's? Is the plaque the consequence or the cause?
Can I ask a question about that? Because when I was researching this is so interesting, because so the amyloid plaque, which I want to get more into, is that kind of like heart disease and heart attacks when they look at the arteries and they see plaque coming from the cholesterol? All these companies are trying to use statins and everything to block the cholesterol in heart disease. So then in Alzheimer's, they're seeing this plaque around the neurons, around the brain cells, and they think, let's target that one, but that's not the cause.
Yes, it's a good analogy. These are not cholesterol plaques in the brain, but these are protein plaques that are made of amyloid protein. And it's the same concept. Yes, it was thought that those plaques somehow were causing neuronal death. And they probably do. They're definitely associated with inflammation and loss of neurons. So it was a very logical premise, and it was the main premise for 30 years. But then, when all these trials failed, the research community really started saying, hey, we need to look earlier in the disease. Because the disease, when you have the plaques, that's when it's kind of established. But people often start having a kind of a slow decrease in cognitive function that precedes the development of full dementia. And it's fact, there is some, with just aging, there is some reduced, forgetting this and forgetting that. And all of us do it a little bit, even when we're young. I used to misplace my keys all the time when I was in my 20s, and I did not have Alzheimer's. Maybe I had ADHD or something. But anyway, the point of the matter is that there is an earlier phase of Alzheimer's. And so people started studying that, and they found three major findings, and they were all very interesting. The first one was that Alzheimer's is actually an inflammatory disease, that there's inflammation going on in the brain. You can see there's a cell called the microglia, which is basically a white cell that lives chronically in the brain. That's where it lives. And it's actually has additional functions just besides being a white cell, but it is in there. It's kind of like there to protect the neurons and stuff. And that cell is inflamed in Alzheimer's for sure. Another, so neuroinflammation is the phrase. Neuro meaning brain or nervous system. But there's inflammation going on in the brain that's very subtle and very real. Now, the second finding was that there was the development of insulin resistance in the brain. Now, a lot of the brain doesn't need insulin. Insulin is that hormone that comes from the pancreas that stimulates the uptake of nutrients, specifically glucose. And glucose is the main carbohydrate in the blood used for energy. And when you become insulin resistant, then the uptake of the fuel, glucose, into the cell is reduced. And so there's less fuel available for the neuron. And so if you have insulin resistance in the brain, that's associated with reduced uptake of glucose into the cell, and glucose is a fuel. So it's a reduced fuel. And so that is a very prominent finding in Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's. Some of the brain doesn't require insulin. And so that section of the brain tends not to be as involved in Alzheimer's as much as other areas of the brain. So Alzheimer's tends to pick certain regions of the brain to really get disease. And it tends to be the insulin sensitive, the areas that require insulin. And it's associated with insulin resistance to those tissues. And so those are the part of the brain that often get hurt first in Alzheimer's. So you got insulin resistance and you got inflammation. And then the third thing is that the neurons, they live on energy. They have to get nutrients and then they make energy. And most of that energy in the brain is coming from mitochondria. And these are present in every cell. And they're kind of like the energy factories. So when food comes in as in this form of glucose or fats or whatever, they get broken down and then channeled through the mitochondria, and out comes energy. And that energy is what we use to do everything we do, from thinking, walking, talking, and basically it's the currency of life. You need to make energy to live. The energy is used to help to do things, and energy is really a particular substance. It's called ATP, and this is made in the mitochondria. It's also made a little bit in the cytoplasm or outside the mitochondria, but 90% comes from the mitochondria, and that is diseased in Alzheimer's. Somehow you're making less energy. The neuron is getting less fuel, it's making less energy, and it's inflamed. And those are the three findings that are occurring in early Alzheimer's. And so the question is, what's causing that?
I want to talk about this new research, which was published last year. I think it was in 2023. You work with some really good brain doctors, Dr. Dale Bredesen and Dr. David Perlmutter, as well as some other brain doctors, talking about the role of fructose. Because all the things that you said around the inflammation, insulin resistance, mitochondrial dysfunction, I think people have maybe heard about that, but then they don't know the mechanism, how that actually damages the brain. But this hypothesis might help understand that. Can you talk more about fructose and how that damages the brain and causes Alzheimer's potentially?
Now you're coming into my area of research, and I spent 30 years doing research on sugar and fructose. So fructose is a sugar, and we think of it as healthy because it's present in honey and fruits, and classically fruits are considered to be very healthy, and we recommend fruits, and I recommend fruits every day. And fruits contain fruit sugar, and that fruit sugar is called fructose. And but fruits have many other wonderful things that we can talk about at some time. But fructose is sweet, and it's so sweet that we love fructose. We have taste buds that look for this sweetness, and we get this dopamine response when we eat sweet things. And the main sweet that we're looking for is fructose. It turns out that sugar, which is the absolute sweet that we love, right? Sugar, table sugar. Some have made a similar sugar called high fructose corn syrup. But sugar is the ultimate that people love, the sweet taste, chocolate cakes, soft drinks. Sugar is very loved in our society, at least by a lot of people, right? A lot of people learn to hate sugar because of the problems it causes, but people love the taste of sugar. Sugar is a glucose and a fructose molecule combined. And remember, I said glucose is the main fuel for the body, the main carbohydrate fuel, and fructose is the sweet. It's sweeter than glucose, and when you combine it, you get a thing called sucrose, which is table sugar. And you can mix it, and then you have high fructose corn syrup. And people love the fructose. So the high fructose corn syrup people realize that they like the fructose more than the glucose. So they make the fructose like 55% and the glucose like 45%. So there's more fructose in liquid high fructose corn syrup. And they take those sugars and the intake of these sugars has skyrocketed over the last 2 centuries. And we've actually plotted it out. And, the average person in 1700 was eating 4 pounds of sugar a year. And it was very expensive. And then when they started making tons of sugar and then high fructose corn syrup, it became inexpensive. So originally, sugar was only afforded by the wealthy. But beginning around 1900, there was so much sugar around that the average person could start buying it. And as they ate it, the increase in sugar went up. And as the increase in sugar went up, so did the frequency of obesity and diabetes and metabolic disease. In fact, they parallel each other beautifully, really. And in the last few years, there's been a kind of leveling of sugar intake. But what's happened is we know from other studies where sugar was introduced in, Pacific Islands and so forth, there's a 10 to 15 year delay between the drop in sugar and the drop in diabetes and obesity. And actually reports are coming out that there's some leveling going on in type 2 diabetes and obesity. It's still huge. The prediction is still that it's going to, again, affect a lot of people. But there is this observation. The CDC just reported it and so forth. And there have been scattered reports suggesting that things are beginning to level off at a terribly high level. Okay. So there was this association, and I was very interested in this. So beginning in early 2000, I started studying it. And we found that sugar could cause obesity and metabolic syndrome and diabetes in animals very easily. And what's more, we found that it wasn't from the calories. We did all these studies, very fancy studies, and we even, and found that we could induce metabolic syndrome in animals, even when we fed them the same amount of calories as another diet. But if it was high in sugar, those animals would become obese and diabetic, and not the others. And so we had this very striking finding that there was a calorie independent effect. Now, one of the things that sugar does is it makes you hungry. So you have to be very careful, because when you feed animals sugar, they will eat more food than the other animals, and that will drive weight gain. So the way you prove that it's calorie independent is you have to what's called pair feed. You feed one group sugar and one group not sugar, and the sugar group wants to eat more, so you don't let them eat more. And when you do that, you can still show that eating sugar is associated with obesity and diabetes. And we also showed that if you don't have a taste, if you knock out the sweet taste, those animals will still love sugar. They don't like artificial sugars because that's driven by the sweet taste bud. But if you're eating real sugar, it's working on dopamine in the brain independently of the sweet receptor. So there's something very special about it. I've published 200 papers on this. I've had NIH funding, and this has been my career to try to figure out this mystery. And the mystery turned out to become more and more important. The more I studied it, it was like Pandora's box. First one thing came out, then another, and they're all not generally not good. And basically, we began to realize that fructose was associated with many metabolic diseases, including Alzheimer's.
As Dr. Johnson mentions, fructose contributes towards Alzheimer's and so many other different chronic health conditions, whether it's weight gain, insulin resistance, even mental health disorders. Now, you might be thinking, well, how is this all related? Well, let me tell you a very quick personal story and why I got interested in this very topic and in health. I started my health podcast about 2 years ago as my dad was diagnosed with frontal temporal dementia, which is very much related to fructose, carbohydrates, and stress. And for those watching, if you have somebody that you know that has dementia or Alzheimer's, you'll know the intense heartache and pain that you'll go through for every single person involved. And recently, I decided to go back to Australia and see my dad after traveling after 2 years. As you can imagine, this was very emotional and very stressful for me because since he's left, he's declined very fast. Now he can't walk, talk, or even care for himself. And although I got so much support from my husband and also my family, I felt I needed more support, and that's why I turned to a therapist. And over the years, I've seen a therapist many, many times, but on this occasion, my therapist was able to help me understand my emotions and provide me with practical solutions, focusing on things like the positive, the fact that my dad receives excellent care in Australia, his wife's support every single day, and also the fact that when I saw him, he still recognizes me. And this has helped me so much, and that is why I have BetterHelp as a sponsor of today's video. BetterHelp is on a mission to help you achieve your health goals, whether it's a New Year's goal or like me, just dealing with a stressful or an emotional event. Now, one of the best things about BetterHelp is that it's really easy to start. All you need to do is fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if the first therapist doesn't feel quite right, you can easily switch to another one until you find someone you truly connect with. So if you feel stuck or you feel overwhelmed, you might want to consider therapy. Simply click on the link of the description of this video or just head to betterhelp.com/primal podcast and get 10% off your first month of therapy. But I'm super interested in this connection between the fructose. And I know that these animal studies that you did, that you showed a direct correlation between giving them more fructose and them developing memory loss.
So just one thing more. Well, two things. One is when we were giving the fructose, we found that it caused three major things in the body. It caused inflammation, very low-grade inflammation. It caused insulin resistance in the tissues like the muscle and the liver, and it caused mitochondrial problems. And in fact, we found that the way fructose works is that it reduces ATP production. And you could say, why would a calorie reduce ATP? Calorie is given to make ATP. So is this even a calorie if it's reducing ATP? But let me try to explain how it works. And this was sort of the big break, and you'll understand this when we get to the Alzheimer's. So it turns out that there's two forms of energy. There's active energy, which is the ATP we make. But you can also store energy. And when you store energy, it's stored as fat or it's stored as glycogen. Glycogen is like stored carbohydrates. But most energy is stored as fat. And then if you don't have any food around, an animal will burn its glycogen and fat to produce the ATP it needs when there's no food around. And the classic is the hibernating animal. It'll get very fat, and then it will not eat, so there's no calories coming in, so it gets its energy by burning the fat. So it turns out that fat has a survival purpose in nature. Animals that want to survive will have enough fat when there's no food around. And a lot of animals will get fat before the dry season, or they get fat before they nest, or they get fat before they migrate long distance. And that's why, because it provides energy to them when they are don't have food. And not only does it provide energy, it provides water, because when you burn fat, you produce water. And there's no water in fat, but the metabolism of fat produces water. And animals in the desert have fat in their tails and the humps. And all this is to help provide water when there's no food around, as well as energy, right? So everyone thought that the way this fat accumulates is that you eat too much and you're producing the energy right from the food. And so your ATP fills up the tank. The tank's full. It's like filling the gas tank. The ATP is at the top, and then the extra goes into fat. And so everyone says, hey, just cut your calories down, and you want a full tank of ATP, but you don't want to have that fat. So just cut out, reduce your food intake, exercise more, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't seem to work. It's like there's some other mechanism. And there is, because that's not how you get fat. The way you get fat is you trick the animal into thinking it doesn't have enough energy. If the animal thinks it doesn't have enough energy, it will seek food. It will forage and seek food. It will eat more food. And the way fructose works is it paralyzes those mitochondria. It causes insulin resistance, reduced fuel getting in, and then it paralyzes the mitochondria through a thing called oxidative stress. And it involves uric acid and other substances. We won't get into that. But it paralyzes the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are producing less energy. There's less calories coming in. There's a little bit of inflammation that drives this process. And now you have low ATP. So you're hungry and you eat more food, but the food's not being turned into energy by the mitochondria because they're paralyzed. So now that food gets converted to stored energy, fat. And that's how a bear does it. It will eat huge amounts of fruit in the fall. Huge amounts. Not like a fruit that we eat that has the vitamin C and all this. They like the fruit really as lush, as sweet as possible. They eat as much fructose as they can. They can eat 10,000 grapes in one day, and they get that huge fructose load, and that triggers the drop in ATP. It makes them hungry, and then they eat tons of food. They gain 10 pounds a day. It's amazing. That's how it works. And we have made sugar available throughout. We have sugar. You can go to the grocery store 24/7. You don't have to hunt like in the old days, like thousands of years ago, where there were no grocery stores and no refrigerators, and basically you had to go out and hunt and track down things and find where the bees were and get the honey. And it was it's a different life. And about 15% of our intake's from sugar right now. And some people are eating 25% of their food is sugar, and all these ultra processed foods. You've heard this name for, packaged foods where it's not natural foods anymore. They've injected it with salt and sugar because they know people like that, right? They like that sweetness. They like the salt. And so we're exposed to it, and we're getting this. And so that's the first thing is, and the second thing is that we had a terrible discovery. I mean it. It was a terrible discovery that we make a ton of fructose. Our bodies convert glucose to fructose. Fructose can only be made from glucose, but when you're eating all those pancakes and rice and breads and cereals and chips, those are filled with carbs that convert to a high glucose that goes up in our blood, gets converted to fructose very rapidly. Maybe 1/3 of the glucose gets converted to fructose in our bodies.
You mentioned that there was evidence around like animal studies. I want to ask about human trials around, not trials because you can't really trial it, but there was evidence around autopsies and then levels of fructose in their brain.
Yes. Yeah, I'm ready to move directly into Alzheimer's now. So let me just say, so when we figured out that fructose was doing these things, and I'm reading the literature about Alzheimer's, and I go, there's a connection. And the first thing I said, okay, well, if there's a connection, does sugar intake correlate with Alzheimer's? And there are many, many studies that link sugar intake with Alzheimer's. Many, many. And sugar intake in the Framingham, for example, if you drink 2 soft drinks a day, that correlates with worse memory, both recent and long-term memory. It's associated with the shrinkage of the brain by CT scan. So if you're a heavy sugar eater, you're in the group that is at risk for developing just a shrinking brain, memory loss, and the same thing is with all other foods that get converted to fructose, like high glycemic carbs. We found the same association. And if you have metabolic syndrome or diabetes, which we know is a fructose-driven condition, those are associated with Alzheimer's. So the epidemiologic, what we call the association studies, are all positive. It's amazing. There's some people who don't think diet has to do with Alzheimer's. They're crazy. The diet correlates dramatically with the risk for Alzheimer's. So that's number one. Okay. There is this interesting finding, though, that as you get Alzheimer's, as it progresses, suddenly you don't eat as well. And many people, when they get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, have actually been losing weight for the last 6 months, but they have a history of being obese. They have a history and there's a very strong association of Alzheimer's with liking sugar. And you probably know from the people that you've cared for who have Alzheimer's, how they love sweets. It's like classic. Okay. It's like 90%. So that's the associations there. And then you're right. So then you do animal studies and you give sugar to rats. And after about 3 weeks, they really get cognitive dysfunction. They have trouble getting through a maze. And what you can do with that's how we measure how well a rat thinks. We give it a maze with a little cheese at the end of the maze, and they have to find their way through the maze. And they get smart. They get smarter and smarter. The first time, of course, they don't know where to go, so they take a long time. The second time, but there's a learning process, and they learn how to get through that maze and find that cheese. They learn how to get, there's a water maze where they have to figure out how to get to a platform where they can rest. That one's kind of associated with anxiety too. There are these tests that we can do to measure cognitive function in rats. And what mainly my colleagues did, because I didn't do these specific studies, they found that sugar was incredible at causing cognitive dysfunction. It is like within 2 weeks, they really have trouble getting through the maze. And then if you look in their brains after feeding the animal sugar, guess what you find? Mitochondrial dysfunction, a reduction in ATP production, insulin resistance. You find inflammation. You find a low ATP levels. This is exactly what early Alzheimer's does. And a group in Egypt fed sugar for 18 months to rats. And what did they find? Amyloid plaques, cognitive dysfunction, shrinking brains, tau protein, the whole bit. Now, I want you to know there is no one who has had, that I'm aware of, that's ever given a possible cause of Alzheimer's that begins from the beginning to the end, that shows all steps. People say, oh, it's inflammation. I'm going to treat with a drug that blocks inflammation. Or I'm going to try to do something to improve the mitochondria. No one says how you get the mitochondrial problem or inflammation from beginning to end. And that can explain the epidemic. And that fits with the associations. That's why I think this is so strong. But there's more data to suggest it. So the way the ATP is dropped is because fructose gets metabolized and paralyzes the mitochondria. And so people have, So this would suggest that fructose needs to be in the brain itself of people with Alzheimer's. So by God, people have done studies where they've looked at autopsies of people with Alzheimer's and age-matched controls. And it's unbelievable. Fructose levels are sky high in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, 5 to 6-fold higher in all the regions of the brain associated with Alzheimer's. And the precursors, remember how the glucose gets converted to fructose? It goes through a substance called sorbitol, which, by the way, is in syrups, sugar-free syrups. So be careful. But sorbitol goes up in the brain too. So it shows that the fructose is being made in the brain. And there's a guy at Yale who took humans and gave them glucose, basically carbs, but infused glucose in the blood to make you kind of like a diabetic. And then he could show that the brain was making huge amounts of fructose in the human through a very clever method. So we know that the brain makes fructose, and we know it makes it when you eat high glycemic carbs and when you eat sugar. Both of those stimulate the production of fructose in the brain. So sugar and carbs are at the root cause of Alzheimer's disease. Now, there are also other evidence. It's not just there. So the metabolism of fructose involves different enzymes. And by God, those enzymes are high in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. So one's called AMP deaminase. This is the enzyme that drives the drop in ATP. Threefold higher in the brains of Alzheimer's patients versus controls. So we've got the whole mechanism. And then a few months ago, a group took animals that were diabetic, that were developing dementia, and they could show it. And they had all the effects of Alzheimer's going on. And they knocked out that enzyme that converts the fructose, that metabolizes the fructose. And they gave it directly to the brain, so only to the brain. And the animals improved. Their cognitive function improved. They actually improved, showing reversibility. So I think that this is the cause of Alzheimer's. There's another bit of evidence, and these weren't in my papers, but there have been 2 Mendelian studies, randomization. This is a genetic test where they look for genetic predisposition to see if it increases the risk. And they found that the genetic predisposition to raise uric acid, which is how the fructose works, was the only ones that were strongly associated with Alzheimer's. One looked at 345 things, and bingo.
I wanted to ask you, so we understand that it's fructose, which is in sugar. So it's a glucose and fructose. But people might be thinking, well, am I still having fructose? But it's so scary that these things that people are eating every single day that's marketed as healthy, very high in fructose.
Yeah, low-fat yogurt, low-fat sweetened yogurt. It's low-fat. That is really bad, okay? Bread, the things that are really do it are sugar, anything sweet, spit it out. Unless it's, from an artificial sugar. Artificial sugars have their own problems, but although there's some that may be healthier. But anyway, the bottom line is sugar and carbs, like pancakes, bread, rice, potatoes, cereal, and chips. If you could cut those back. Now, we live in a society where 50% of our diet is carbs. And so there's actually evidence that low-carb diets, the Mediterranean diet, has some carbs, the fair amount of bread, but otherwise it's pretty good. It's low in sugar. A low-carb diet, an Atkins diet, or a keto diet, they've already been reported to improve Alzheimer's. There you go. GLP-1 agonists, these Ozempic, semaglutide, they're reducing Alzheimer's too. And guess what? They're blocking fructose metabolism. The whole thing fits. It's like a glove. It's like fits perfect. I think we can safely say that this is very likely the cause. There could be other causes. Oh, here's another one. Like if you get a concussion, that's associated with increased risk for dementia. And there are different types, but it increases the risk for Alzheimer's, concussions. And guess what happens when you have a concussion? The blood flow is affected a little bit, and that activates the enzymes to make fructose. It even fits there. Studies in animals with concussions show that fructose is being made in the brain. So it's real. And the Lancet came out with a commission on Alzheimer's where they talk about genes and, but they never mentioned diet. It's like absurd. It's absurd. Diet is so strongly associated with Alzheimer's. How can they omit that? I actually wrote a letter to the editor. I hope it gets published. But oh my God, that is just a shame because it makes people think that it has nothing to do with diet, but it has everything to do with diet. Now, there have been a lot of people who've recognized the importance of diet in brain health. And when we were looking at this, I contacted David Perlmutter, who's my friend. He's a famous physician. He's written Grain Brain and all these different books. And also Dale Bredesen has been a leader in trying to find ways to reverse Alzheimer's or slow Alzheimer's. And he also had found that, reducing sugar was a benefit. And so we joined together, and we also joined with hardcore neuroscientists, researchers like Maria Nagel, and that's where this paper came from. So we're supported by a strong category of people who are experts. And right now, in my lab, or I should say in my collaborator's lab, there's an active studies looking at how fructose causes Alzheimer's, and it's working through the microglia. So that microglia is like at the heart of it. And also there's a cell called the astrocyte, but we're actually figuring out how this works.
Can I ask you a question about the fructose? Because you mentioned the bread, cereals, pasta, rice, and people probably think, yep, I shouldn't have those things. But there are other things that I wanted to ask you about. Do you think that orange juice could cause Alzheimer's?
Oh, a very tough question. It's a very tough question. The whole area of juices in general look kind of worrisome that juices may be bad. But it's sort of like how much are you drinking? And so here's the truth. Fruits have a lot of wonderful things. They have what we call flavonoids, potassium, fiber. All these things are like really, really helpful. And we can show that vitamin C, they actually counter some of the effects of fructose. And the way a fruit tree works, is a lot of these good guys are present when the fruit's not ripe. And it actually keeps an animal that's trying to gain weight from wanting to eat it. So the animals will wait till the fruit ripens. As the fruit ripens, the good things go down and the sweetness and sugar content goes up. And so there's a symbiosis between plants and animals related to fruit. But we tend to like tartar fruit that is richer in these things. And like oranges are great and really have a huge vitamin C content. And, and these are positives. Now, but the problem is when you drink juice, you often remove a lot of the pulp, and the pulp has fiber and all these things that slow the absorption. So when you drink a glass of juice, you could be drinking 20 grams of fructose in less than a minute. And that's the problem. So when you drink it fast, there's a big bolus of fructose. And if it's the concentration that triggers the degree of ATP falling. It's like a dimmer switch. If there's a little bit of fructose, drops it a little bit. If there's a huge amount of fructose, it drops it, bam. And so when you drink juices, it really relates to the speed of ingestion. We actually did a study with apple juice, and we could show that if you sipped it over a couple hours, it really didn't do much. But if you drank it right away, we could show the activation of this pathway within 1 minute. I mean, it's like unbelievable. It's very fast. So, or within a few minutes, I maybe exaggerating a little bit, but within a few minutes. So, um, yeah, fruit juices. There's some fruit juices that are really good. And I know you're from Australia originally, and close to you is New Zealand, and the kiwis and kiwi fruit is really high in vitamin C and not so much in sugar. It's really a great fruit. Berries, blackberries, blueberries. I mean, you can overdo it with any fruit if you eat a huge amount very fast, but I would say that in general fruits are good.
Can I ask about, so obviously fruit juices, very high concentration of fructose because it's like lots of fruit condensed down without the fiber. I have to ask you about fiber because I've had other doctors on here differing thoughts about fiber, that it's an indigestible waste product. And yes, it feeds the bacteria in the gut, but how is that beneficial? And secondly, that it is likening to rotting in the gut. So, my train of thought here, just to get your perspective. So, if fruit, and I'm not trying to say that nobody should eat fruit or people should eat fruit, but it's just to elaborate it because people hear different opinions. So, if people eat fruit, fruit has a level of fructose, and the idea is that fiber is going to block the level of fructose. Is that correct? Why would that be healthy?
So let's talk about that. So fiber is not digested by human enzymes, but some bacteria can digest it. Most of the bacteria live in the colon, the last part of the gut. You know, the large bowel is the main place. There's some in the small bowel, and so when you eat fiber, it's like a emulsifier. It's like it's coating and preventing the access of the fructose to the intestine. So if you eat a lot of fiber, the absorption of fructose is still pretty fast, but it's slower than if you drink a soft drink that has no fiber. And in fact, if you eat fructose with a meal and any food, the amount of fructose, the absorption rate of fructose is often reduced than if you're drinking a soft drink on an empty stomach, because there's nothing stopping the fructose from being absorbed. But if there's all kinds of things in your stomach like popcorn and foods and fiber, that can slow the absorption. And because the way fructose works is it triggers this reduction in ATP. That reduction is concentration dependent. So when the fructose gets there fast, the concentration's high because it's all coming in like a bolus. But if it tweaks in over, if it's the absorption slowed, it will reduce the effects. And that's why natural fruits can have 8 grams, an orange can have 8 grams of fructose, but it probably is not going to, or 6 grams, but it probably will not have the same effect as like drinking a soft drink, even if you drink part of a soft drink on an empty stomach because of the fiber and all these other good things. Now, when the fiber gets down to the large bowel, the bacteria can break it down, and bacteria can make good, they call them short chain fatty acids, and they can make good ones and they can make bad ones. And so some short chain fatty acids like butyrate are thought to be pretty healthy, and it can stimulate the production of a thing called betaine, which is like it blocks inflammation. But you can also produce acetate, and acetate can be absorbed and can help drive fat production. So it's not all good. It's just not, in general, it's thought to have benefits.
So I want to talk about the solution then, around what people should eat if they want to not have Alzheimer's or reverse it or even prevent it. Is there a way to do that through dietary means?
Yes, I think there is. So The first thing is, the sugar pathway probably explains a lot of Alzheimer's, but there's going to be some other pathways that get to the same place. But I think sugar, fructose is, in my opinion, and I'm one researcher, but in my opinion, it is the major cause. It is the principal cause. And it's driven by excessive carbohydrates. And currently we're eating 50% of our diet is carbohydrates. And I think that that's too much. And it would be, I think the first step is just to cut back on buying things like potato chips and cut back on how much bread you eat, cut back on how much rice and potatoes you eat. Vegetables and things like that, don't worry about them. There's not enough fructose in there, and there's so much good things in vegetables. But there are a few big bad guys. Chips, cereals, these cereals in the morning, especially if they're sugared, they all can do it. And so these are the bad ones. So you cut back on those. That's the number one. Try to eat healthy. Now, it turns out that salt activates the enzyme to convert the glucose to fructose. So when you eat a salted French fry, that's much worse than a baked potato. Okay? It's just much worse because it's got the salt that helps convert that potato into fructose, but it also is coated with oil and because when you activate this, you get hungry, so you eat the oil, which is high calorie fats. And there's this very interesting thing, because fructose makes you eat more. It also makes you kind of like fatty foods like fried chicken and things like this. It actually activates in the brain to look for high calorie foods. So if you are eating a lot of sugar and you become what we call leptin resistant, where you keep eating, then the high fat foods are really driving obesity because you want them and you eat more than you need. But if you're on a low carb diet and you no longer have enough fructose to have this switch turned on where you're actively hungry, then you can have a high fat diet and you're not going to get fat because you control your weight. So that's why a keto diet can be a high fat diet, yet no one gains weight. But if you put carbs and fat together, they really gain weight, whereas carbs alone make you hungry, but you don't have the fat that drives your massive weight gain. So the bottom line is carb restriction, salt restriction, drink water. Water helps block this too. It keeps the serum, sodium, and all these things healthy, which we know if you get dehydrated, it's like the animal says, okay, I need water. Fat is a source of water. And so it triggers this process.
Okay, one thing that people find quite healthy to add into their low carb diet is honey, which is very high in fructose. Do you think that honey is something that can also contribute towards Alzheimer's?
The $1 million question, because no one's really done those studies. But here's what we know. We do know that honey contains a lot of fructose and glucose. And when I visited Kuwait to review the obesity epidemic there and diabetes, and if you're a Kuwaiti, 25% of them have diabetes. And you know what they eat? Honey desserts. Everything is honey and bread. I will tell you, I believe that you can really get into trouble eating a lot of honey. Now, honey is delicious, and honey contains a lot of things besides fructose, and some of those things could well counter some of the effects of fructose. It could be like a natural fruit, where a little bit of honey is like eating a natural fruit. It's very possible and probably likely that very small amounts of honey might even be healthy, because they do contain other things than just the fructose. But if you eat a ton of it, it's sort of like drinking the fruit juice. You're going to get into big trouble.
I almost think that can people have a little bit of honey, because anything that's like and this is people doing a ketogenic diet, and the reason why it works so well is because it really fixes your hormones, your insulin, leptin, ghrelin, and all the rest of it.
Well, there is a twist there, actually. If you're on a keto diet, fructose is turned into glucose, not the reverse. So if you're actually on a keto diet, when you eat fructose a little bit, you can overwhelm it, right? But if you eat a little bit, that fructose doesn't activate the switch. It gets converted to glucose because the body is searching for some glucose. And so it will preferentially switch the fructose to glucose. And also the gut, when you eat, the first 3 or 4 grams of fructose always get converted to glucose. So bottom line is, if you're on a keto diet, yeah, keep putting the honey on the bread. Just don't put a lot. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, you can't put it on bread when you're in a keto diet. So that's a nonsensical, yeah. But what you could put a little bit of honey on whatever you put on in a keto diet. When you're in a keto diet, where do you put the honey?
I don't have honey. I would never have honey because, see, I mean, it really depends on the person's background. My dad has dementia, so this is where I came to you with this topic because it was quite interesting to me. And as you said, dementia patients or Alzheimer's patients, they crave sugar. My dad, he is in the later stage of his dementia. He's in a hospital bed. When he has sugar, he goes, it's even worse. Everything gets worse. So based on that, I don't have any sugar. I don't have any honey. I know it's very extreme. Probably people are thinking, what the heck? Like, I can't live like that. But if you know somebody that has Alzheimer's or dementia, you'll take some action.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many people that absolutely love honey, and there's not really that much studies done on it. So it's hard for me because I know that fruits contain a lot of good things. Honey probably does too, but no one studied it. But it's my belief that if you eat a lot of honey, you're in trouble. And it is also interesting that if you're on a keto diet, you can, a small amount of fructose will actually be converted to glucose. So those are two interesting things. I'm sorry about your dad. And, there's also one other story about this Alzheimer's and sugar that I'd like to talk about. And that is, why would sugar cause dementia? Why would fructose cause dementia if this is a pathway that's involved in nature and biology and it's supposed to be a survival pathway? Why would it cause dementia? And I think I have an answer for that. And I should mention I have a book on this called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat that talks about this more. But anyway, remember that when you eat fructose, it's used by animals to help them store fat. It tricks them into thinking they're in a low energy state. And part of that trickery is to stimulate foraging. And foraging means that the animal goes looking for food. And foraging is actually a specific pathway that's activated by certain parts of the brain that allows an animal to do things that it normally wouldn't do, because when you forage, you have to go into areas you may never have been. There's predators, there's all kinds of things. You're not sure if you're going to survive because it's a dangerous world if you're living in nature. And so the way it works is when you eat fructose, it stimulates foraging, and studies in humans show that it wants to inhibit the areas that are involved in self-control, because you've got to have good you can't have good self-control if you're going to be going into dangerous areas, or you'd say, hey, there's no way I'm going to go in there. There was a lion seen there 3 days ago. And what's more, you're going to want to inhibit that recent memory about, hey, the lion was there 3 days ago. So it turns out that when you eat fructose, it reduces the blood flow to certain regions of the brain, and that's associated with reduced glucose uptake and a drop in energy. And the way it works is it works on the cortex, the thinking areas of the brain, and it works on the recent memory sites. And actually, the occiput, where the vision is, it stimulates that because it wants you to find the food. So fructose reduces blood supply and energy in certain regions of the brain to help you forage. And it's associated with wandering and foraging behavior. So over time, when you keep eating fructose, you're stunning those areas of the brain all the time. And so what becomes like a foraging, initially it's great because it makes you an adventurer, a scout, and it's I'm going to be an astronaut, but when the ATP drops a lot, suddenly you become a slug and you're tired, and so it stimulates and then depresses. But with foraging, this stimulation is what's used to help get the animal to find food. So over time, that area of the brain starts to atrophy and get all these diseases that end up as Alzheimer's. But whereas the occiput, which was getting good blood flow from fructose, it's preserved. So that's what happens in Alzheimer's. So the regions of the brain involved in foraging get diseased first, and then the things like the occiput, vision, it tends to stay. And so you can still see things. It's not like knocking out that part of the brain. And that's why about out of 10 Alzheimer's patients, probably about 7 of them have this thing called the wandering response, where they can just wander off. And it's scary, sometimes people are found in parking lots and drive off and don't know where they are. And, it's a horrible setting. But I think the wandering response is a reflection of this biologic response in nature for foraging.
Is there any test for Alzheimer's that people can say, I can see clearly that you have early stages of Alzheimer's?
Well, there are a lot of people trying to develop tests and measuring amyloid in the CSF, and there are a lot of markers. I would say there isn't a good one. And I think that at least that's available, that I'm aware of it at this point. There are probably some researchers who may think they've got some good tests at this point, but there's nothing really available. What I would say is, we are in a world where all these foods are around and they're not going to go away. And the best thing you can do is to, try to eat healthy, stay well hydrated and exercise, and be aware that certain foods are not good for the brain, right? Sugar is not good for the brain. Try to reduce it. Can you still have a cake on your birthday? Maybe. Yeah. Why not? It's not like I'm telling you not to eat any sugar or any carbs. That would be the wrong message. But I think that if we know what's bad, we can really significantly reduce our sugar intake. Really read those labels on the package. If it says high fructose corn syrup, don't buy it. Don't drink soft drinks. There is a sugar. There's one artificial sugar that I've gotten involved with because it looks like fructose. It's not as sweet, but it looks like it's maybe protective, and it lowers glucose and it stimulates GLP-1 or Ozempic.
Is that allulose?
Yeah. So I've gotten involved in that. I joined a company where I'm the chief scientific officer to look at allulose, and frankly, it does look somewhat promising. I think we need more studies, but yeah, it may be a good, if you really like sweets, it's probably one of the best alternatives. Stevia and I don't see much wrong with stevia. Splenda, I don't see too much anything really that jumps out with Splenda that's bad. Some of these other ones are bad, aspartame and saccharin. Don't go there. Allulose, there's data saying it's good, because it lowers blood glucose and things like that.
All this kind of thing that people are trying to say, what is the good sugar? What should I avoid? But if you know that fructose and carbohydrates and sugars are bad, why wouldn't there be kind of a more blanket statement just to avoid them. Forget what processed food and big food is doing, but why? Because to keep it simple, because I think people are confused. That's why I had the question about orange juice, because people are thinking that's healthy, and then dates and figs and all this crap.
Dates and figs are the highest fruit containing fructose. I would avoid those two. I mean, I'm a scientist, Rena, and things like honey haven't really been studied. Epidemiologically, you don't want to be eating a lot of honey. If you go to Kuwait where they don't eat as much sugar, they have some of the highest obesity rates in the world. I mean, honey desserts were everywhere. Um, you know, but here's the story. We do need some carbs. If you're, people on a keto diet, well, you can make glucose from proteins, and some people actually can do well on a keto diet chronically, but there are very few that can do that. Um, and so, yes, yeah, the best would be a keto diet, and the best, but it's very, very hard for a lot of people to do that. Carb restriction, everyone can cut out the bad carbs or at least reduce them. If you're worried that you might be getting Alzheimer's, just avoid bread and rice, chips, cereal. These are the big ones.
Is there any early signs that somebody could say that I'm on the way to get Alzheimer's? Things to look out for in the body or symptoms?
Well, yeah, I mean, so it typically begins with recent memory issues. It typically begins with, oftentimes there's sleep disturbances and so forth. But I don't want to scare everyone who has a lapse of recent memory for some event to think that they're developing Alzheimer's. There's a lot of other things. I mean, ADHD and conditions like that where you don't focus can also lead to it. That, by the way, is also probably linked with fructose. So in general, our population's eating way too much sugar. We're eating way too much carbs. So you do want to cut back. And but to tell people never to eat these again seems kind of draconian. Draconian is the word.
See, that's the thing. I guess for me, I tend to be not extreme, but I guess if you have a why, and I'm quite, I guess, consistent in what I do, following a ketogenic diet, and it just works for me in terms of mental health, et cetera, and with my dad. But I get it. Like, not everyone can follow it, and that's why giving options, which tends to be carbohydrate restriction or even a low carb diet, seems to be more flexible, because what you were talking about was the compliance and the consistency with being on a keto diet, not the efficacy or the lack of efficacy with a keto diet, if that makes sense, that people can understand. It's more that year in, year out, can you stick with it? Who knows? But you can stick with lowering the carbohydrates.
That's right. And it's sort of like the alcohol story. A lot of people spend, especially us older people, it was it's so common to have a glass of wine with dinner. And for a long time, we all thought that one glass of wine was actually better than zero. There was this paper in the New England Journal you may remember was, it was back in the 80s, but it said that, in terms of wine, one glass actually has a better outcome than zero, and two is like zero, and anything more than two is negative in terms of its effects on cholesterol and cardiovascular health and all that. Now we're thinking that alcohol is probably not that healthy at all, and the dream would be to probably not drink alcohol, but to tell people, especially people who've just been doing it for so long, and it's part of their lifestyle, it's very hard. And so I now recommend, to limit alcohol intake to 1 glass, like if it's wine, 1 glass um, at a meal, but it's probably better to drink zero, right? And certain alcohol like beer actually is sadly associated with more activation of this pathway than alcohol, than a wine. Sorry, and then hard alcohol is pretty bad too, and especially when you mix it with sugar. So so what I've been saying is, try to cut out actual, drinks that have any kind of sweetener, rum and stuff like that. Try to cut that out. Try to, you know, cut out beer, but if you really like alcohol, have a glass of wine every now and then. That's my story, but actually it's probably healthier not to drink alcohol at all. It's just so hard to be that draconian.
I think that you're very realistic, Dr. Johnson. You probably see a lot of patients and you're like, well, they have some alcohol and they have carbs and sugar. So I think that your advice is balanced, realistic, and can help a wide proportion of people avoid the fructose. You also have, as you mentioned, a fabulous book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, which will be linked in the description of this episode. If people would like to find more information about your wonderful work, where can they find you?
Well, I do have a website, drrichardjohnson.com. I'm found in my books and most of the bookstores.
Everything's going to be linked in the episode. People can click away and find every place that you're at. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I think the work in Alzheimer's and brain diseases and health conditions is very important. And the link between the fructose was interesting, so people can look at that, reduce their fructose and overall sugar, and save their brain. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rina.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. Richard Johnson. If you'd like to know more information about how to prevent Alzheimer's disease, simply go to the link of this episode in the description, click on How to Prevent Alzheimer's, open that up, and you'll see a full list there and a guide on how to prevent Alzheimer's with actionable steps. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm on Instagram, also on X, formerly known as Twitter, under the name of the Primal Podcast. Now, if you love this episode, you'll also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Mark Brahana. Dr. Brahana is a functional dentist, and we're talking all about the oral microbiome. Now, the oral microbiome is closely connected to your gut microbiome, and Dr. Brahana will talk about how this is closely related to all of these different chronic diseases that we're facing in the world. And he'll talk about the perfect oral care routine for you to fix your oral microbiome. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.